Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the sands of time, and the literal sands of the Sahara, to explore the mysterious libraries of Timbuktu you've probably never heard of. You're already imagining camels, right? Good. But forget the romantic postcards. This journey is hot, slow, and dusty, and you probably won't survive it unless you're carrying about a gallon of water per mile. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are, so drop that in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a golden desert that seems to go on forever. The air shimmers with heat, and above you the sun stares down like an unblinking eye. The sand crunches under your shoes, which, if we're honest, aren't really suited for this trip. Next time bring better ones. A caravan of camels plods past, each one draped with colorful woven blankets, bells jingling faintly as they move. The scent of dust and distant incense clings to everything. You squint at the horizon where a cluster of mud-colored buildings rises from the dunes, looking more like a mirage than a city. This is Timbuktu, not just a metaphor for the middle of nowhere, but once a thriving center of knowledge, trade, and culture. You trudge forward and already feel the sting of the Sahara sun burning the back of your neck. A cheeky thought occurs to you. Who in their right mind thought building a scholarly paradise in the middle of a desert was a good idea? Well, someone did, and somehow it worked. For centuries, Timbuktu was the place where camel caravans brought not only salt and gold, but also scrolls, books, and ideas. As you get closer to the city's outskirts, you pass a caravan unloading crates. You catch a glimpse of manuscripts wrapped in goatskin and tied with rough rope. The traders are shouting prices and laughing at each other's jokes, probably about how wide-eyed you look right now. The mainstream history you probably know, or think you know, is that Europe had the monopoly on knowledge during the Middle Ages. But here's the first surprise. Timbuktu's libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts at a time when some European kings couldn't even sign their names. You finally cross under an archway and into the city itself, and the temperature dips just a little. The streets are narrow, and the tall mud brick walls of the buildings cast welcome shadows. There are faint murals painted here and there, flowing geometric patterns, faded symbols that seem to hum with history. It smells of spices and earth, with a faint sweetness of dates roasting somewhere nearby. Children scurry past, balancing bundles of kindling on their heads, and one of them shoots you a grin, then disappears down an alleyway. A man dressed in a brilliant blue robe, called a bubu, nods at you and gestures to follow him. You have no idea what his name is, but since he clearly knows where he's going and you clearly don't, you go. You're led through a maze of alleys and stairways until you arrive at a small courtyard with a wooden door so old it looks like it should be in a museum. The man gives it a gentle push, and it groans open on heavy hinges. You step inside and immediately feel a kind of reverence settle over you, like walking into a cathedral. The walls are lined with shelves, and the shelves are lined with books, not modern books with glossy covers, but thick manuscripts wrapped in faded leather, some tied with silk cords, others stacked so precariously you half expect them to topple. A thin layer of sand dusts everything, softening the colors, as though the desert has been trying unsuccessfully to claim them. You reach out and gently touch one of the manuscripts, and the leather is surprisingly warm under your fingers, as if it still remembers the hands that wrote it centuries ago. One mainstream historical fact you can't ignore here. These manuscripts weren't just copies of the Quran or dry records of trade. They contained treatises on medicine, astronomy, law, philosophy, poetry, and even humor, yes, jokes in medieval Mali. Historians still argue whether the manuscripts were produced entirely locally, or whether some were imported from Andalusia and the Middle East. But what's clear is that this city was a beacon of intellectual life at a time when much of Europe was stumbling through its so-called Dark Ages. And then, the quirky tidbit. Many of these books were written not on imported paper, but on locally crafted parchment made from gazelle skin. Gazelle skin. Can you imagine sitting down to copy an entire astronomical treatise by hand on the hide of an animal that probably outran you a month ago? Yet here they are. The air in the room is warm and heavy, and you notice that someone has left a small clay bowl of water in the corner, not for drinking, but to keep a little moisture in the air so the dry desert doesn't completely crack the pages. Your guide smiles faintly, then picks up one manuscript at random, unties the silk cord, and opens it to a page filled with graceful Arabic script that curls across the page like waves. Little gold stars decorate the margins, and in the corner, a note scribbled by a long-dead scholar corrects the text, because even geniuses make typos. He lets you hold it. The manuscript weighs more than you expect, solid and serious in your hands, but also delicate, like holding the heartbeat of a civilization. There's a faint sound from outside, a camel braying, someone calling out the hour, children laughing. But here in this quiet room, it feels as though time has slowed to a crawl. You catch yourself smiling. Maybe you've tracked sand into the room, maybe you've already sweated through your shirt, but here you are, holding proof that the desert once bloomed with knowledge. And that's just the beginning of the story. Section 2. The door creaks behind you as your guide steps out into the sunlight, and you reluctantly follow, blinking against the sudden glare. The air outside feels even hotter now after the cool quiet of the library. You squint at the sky, a perfect, punishing blue, and feel the gritty kiss of sand on your cheek as a light wind picks up. You trudge toward the edge of town, following your guide deeper into Timbuktu, where the city meets the desert in a blurred line of dust and gold. Above, the sun hangs huge and indifferent, but even in this harsh light you can make out the faint glimmer of stars waiting their turn behind the veil of day. Your guide pauses by a camel that's been tied to a wooden post and points across the dunes. This, he says softly, was the path of knowledge. You don't answer, you're too busy noticing that the camel seems to be judging you with a faintly superior expression. You turn your gaze back to the horizon, where an ancient caravan route stretches out like a faint scar in the sand. It's hard to imagine that this empty expanse was once alive with caravans of hundreds, even thousands, of camels trudging their way across the Sahara. They carried salt slabs stacked like bricks, shimmering gold dust sealed in leather pouches, and most surprising of all, manuscripts, packed carefully in wooden chests to shield them from the grit and heat. Here's a mainstream fact to ground you. At its peak in the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was a nexus on the trans-Saharan trade network. Caravans arrived from all directions, north from Morocco, east from Egypt, south from the Sahel, and with them came wealth and ideas that fed the city's libraries. Historians still argue whether the demand for books was purely scholarly or whether owning manuscripts became a status symbol, something to show off at dinner parties like rare wine. Either way, these caravans were the arteries that kept the intellectual heart of Timbuktu beating. Your guide beckons you closer to the camel, which, to its credit, doesn't bite you as you tentatively pat its flank. One of these, he says, could carry as many as 100 manuscripts stacked carefully in wooden boxes, more valuable than gold. He chuckles, though, he adds, less tasty. The quirky tidbit. It's said that some traders wrapped manuscripts in layers of animal fat and beeswax to waterproof them against desert storms. So if you're ever in the Sahara and find a suspiciously greasy scroll, you know what it is. You take a few steps out onto the sand. Your feet sink into the hot grains and your shoes, already the wrong choice, squeak in protest. You can almost hear the faint echo of bells from long-departed caravans, their slow rhythm stretching across centuries. As you imagine those ancient processions, you start to notice the tracks of today's traders still imprinted faintly alongside. Even now, families in Timbuktu maintain connections with those old routes, bringing goods, though usually by truck these days and sometimes still by camel. The air smells faintly of leather dust and something sharp you can't quite place, maybe salt. Your guide picks up a handful of sand and lets it slip through his fingers, whispering that the desert remembers everything and forgets nothing. You roll your eyes just slightly, but a shiver still snakes down your spine. The two of you walk further out, and as you crest a dune, you see the full scope of the desert stretching in every direction. It's so vast and empty that for a moment you feel like a tiny speck in some gigantic hourglass. The sand glitters faintly as though sprinkled with powdered stars. Your guide tells you that even during the golden age of Timbuktu, the journey to reach it could take up to 3 months from Morocco, through blistering days and freezing nights. Entire caravans sometimes vanished into sandstorms, swallowed by the desert. And yet, they kept coming, driven by the promise of wealth and wisdom. You turn and look back at the city. From this vantage point, Timbuktu seems to grow organically from the desert floor, its walls and roofs shaped by the same winds that sculpt the dunes. The sun has begun to dip ever so slightly, softening the light, and the mud brick buildings glow a warm amber. Your guide sits on a flat rock, gesturing for you to join him. You collapse beside him, ignoring the grains of sand working their way into your socks. A pair of camels stand a little distance away, swishing their tails and making soft, snuffling noises. You swear one of them is still judging you. He tells you a story about an old saying: salt comes from the north, gold from the south, and knowledge from Timbuktu. You murmur the words back to yourself, feeling the weight of them settle in your chest. There's a quiet reverence in the air now. You glance up and notice the first star peeking out of the deepening sky. The desert is cooling, and a soft breeze tugs at your sleeves. You imagine yourself as a scholar 5 centuries ago, arriving on one of these caravans, weary and dust-covered, but clutching a box of manuscripts like treasure. You'd stumble into the city, collapse in some shaded courtyard, and maybe, just maybe, your name would end up written in the margins of a book that someone else would be holding centuries later. The thought makes you smile faintly as the guide rises and brushes off his robes. He gestures back toward the city, and you follow, glancing one last time at the endless sands. Behind you, the camels watch you leave, probably thinking about how unprepared you are for a real desert journey. And honestly, they're right. Section 3. You slip back into the cool alleys of Timbuktu just as the last of the sun ducks behind the dunes. The heat of the day still clings faintly to the walls, but a softness is settling into the air now, the kind of hush that only comes after the desert has burned itself out. Your guide leads you deeper into the city, weaving through narrow passageways that twist like lazy snakes. The mud brick buildings rise high on either side of you, their surfaces etched with faint patterns, geometric swirls, faded crescents that catch the dim light in quiet little flashes. Above, a few wooden beams jut from the walls, casting crooked shadows that look like skeletal fingers. You run your hand along the wall as you walk, feeling its strange texture, gritty and yet somehow smooth, warm from the sun but already cooling. This is adobe, made of sun-baked mud mixed with straw and sometimes bits of broken pottery, a material that has stood here for centuries, outlasting wars, sandstorms, and tourists in bad shoes. A woman in a flowing indigo veil glides past, balancing a jug of water on her head, and gives you a knowing look as though she can tell you're not from around here. You offer a sheepish smile, which she does not return. The guide chuckles softly behind you. The alleys get narrower, and you notice tiny wooden doors set low in the walls, some no taller than your chest, and tiny windows covered with woven mats. These are homes and, in many cases, libraries too. In Timbuktu, knowledge was often kept right where people lived, not locked away in giant institutions but nestled between living rooms and kitchens. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Timbuktu's unique architecture isn't just beautiful, it's functional. Those thick mud walls insulate against the brutal heat, and even the cold desert nights, while the narrow streets funnel cooling breezes through the city like a natural air conditioner. Historians still argue whether the designs came entirely from local innovation, or whether elements were borrowed from Moorish Andalusia and adapted to the desert environment. Either way, it works, and you're grateful for it. The guide pauses before a particularly small, unassuming door and motions for you to step closer. You bend down, yes, bend and duck through. Inside, the temperature drops almost immediately, and the smell changes too. Dry earth, faintly smoky, with a hint of something sweet like dates or honey. You're standing in a cramped but orderly room lined floor to ceiling with shelves. Manuscripts lie in careful stacks, some wrapped in cloth, others bare and showing their worn leather covers. There's a low table in the center with a few more books laid open, their pages gently curling at the edges. The quirky tidbit: many of these manuscripts have little notes scribbled in the margins, not by professional scribes but by students, family members, and later readers. Sometimes they're serious, clarifications, disagreements with the text. Other times they're personal, like "Ahmed owes me 2 chickens," or "It was very hot today." Medieval sticky notes, if you will. You lower yourself onto a cushion and run your fingers along one of the shelves, careful not to disturb the careful order. The guide watches you but doesn't intervene. He seems to know you're here to look, not to take. A faint breeze drifts in from a small window, and you catch a faint golden glow from outside, the last of the sun surrendering to night. The mud walls around you seem to sigh, settling as the air cools. You can hear the city outside now. The faint call of the muezzin, the shuffle of sandals on the street, the faint clang of a pot from a nearby kitchen. It all blends together into a quiet rhythm that feels ancient, eternal. On one shelf, you spot a manuscript with an ornate leather cover stamped with gold patterns. You pull it down carefully and open it. The calligraphy inside is breathtaking, neat rows of Arabic script that almost seem to dance across the page. In the corner, a faint drawing of a crescent moon peers out at you, as though inviting you to keep reading. Historians still argue whether all these manuscripts were produced here in Timbuktu, or if some were commissioned from elsewhere and brought in by caravan. What is certain, though, is that families guarded them fiercely, often hiding their collections from colonial powers, invaders, and even nosy neighbors. You notice now that the room is shaped to maximize shade and minimize heat. The roof slants in a clever way to trap cooler air below. Even the shelves are built into the walls to save space and protect the books from direct sunlight. There's no glass, no metal, nothing modern, and yet it works perfectly. As you sit there, surrounded by the smell of paper, leather, and sand, you can almost hear the voices of the scribes who once worked here. The scratch of their pens, the low murmur of prayers, the occasional muttered curse when ink spilled in the wrong place. The guide picks up a small manuscript from another shelf and opens it to reveal a list, not of names, but of astronomical calculations, complete with tiny star charts sketched in the margins. The desert sky above must have been their ceiling of inspiration. You smile faintly as you imagine scholars hunched over these very pages hundreds of years ago, debating the finer points of medicine or poetry, pausing only to sip from a clay cup of water and swat away the occasional fly. A faint knock comes from outside, someone checking in perhaps, and the guide stands, nodding to you. You rise reluctantly, already feeling a little homesick for this small, quiet room. As you duck back through the little wooden door, the warm night air greets you again, and the city seems to hum softly around you. The mud walls glow faintly under a rising moon, and the streets are alive with shadows. The guide looks back at you and says something that you're not sure you fully understand, but it sounds a lot like, "Everything here whispers, if you listen long enough." And just for a second, you believe it. Hey guys, tonight we're going to slip quietly into the sands of time, and the literal sands of the Sahara, to explore the mysterious libraries of Timbuktu you've probably never You and your guide keep walking through the labyrinth of moonlit alleys, your sandals now full of fine, silky dust. The city has quieted, but not completely. There are still a few hushed conversations drifting from behind wooden doors, and the occasional burst of laughter from some courtyard where a late meal is being shared. He stops at a heavy door with iron studs and gives it 2 deliberate knocks. A moment later, it swings inward, revealing a warm glow spilling into the alley and the scent of something faintly herbal, maybe mint, maybe something stranger. You're ushered into what seems to be a private study, though study hardly does it justice. The room is larger than any you've seen so far, with thick carpets underfoot and lanterns casting soft golden light that dances across the walls. Shelves here are grander, too, and a few glass-fronted cabinets gleam in the corner, protecting some of the oldest and most delicate manuscripts. A man in a crisp white robe stands in the center, his hands folded neatly behind his back. His face is lined but kind, and he greets you with a slight bow before gesturing to a low seat near him. You sit, sinking into the cushion, and try not to look too much like you're about to drool on the priceless history surrounding you. This, the guide murmurs, is one of the descendants of the great custodians of Timbuktu. And sure enough, as you glance around the room, you notice framed sketches and faded photographs hanging on the walls, stern-looking men and women, always standing near shelves, always with a book or a pen in hand. The scholar seats himself across from you and begins leafing through a stack of manuscripts on the table. He's gentle but quick, his fingers practiced. He pauses to show you a few pages, one filled with bright, jewel-toned illumination, another with cramped notes scribbled in the margins in 3 different hands. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The families of Timbuktu often passed down their collections for generations, treating them as both a sacred duty and a badge of honor. Some families even split their manuscripts into several locations to protect them from theft, fire, or the occasional overzealous colonial administrator. Historians still argue whether these families always understood the global value of their collections, or whether they simply saw them as part of their personal legacy. The quirky tidbit: one family reportedly kept their manuscripts in large clay jars buried in the courtyard for years, alongside pickled lemons and salted fish, because, hey, that's where it was coolest. Imagine pulling out your copy of Avicenna's medical treatises from between last season's olives and a jar of dates. You watch as the scholar unties the string on another manuscript and opens it to a page that gleams faintly in the lantern light. He leans closer, running a finger under the elegant script, and begins to explain what you're looking at. It's a legal text from the 16th century, full of rulings on everything from land disputes to what to do if your neighbor's camel eats your wheat spoiler. The neighbor pays up. The scholar smiles faintly and looks at you. These are not just books, he says softly. They are conversations. And it's true. As you peer closer, you can see notes layered on notes, sometimes contradicting, sometimes clarifying, sometimes just marveling at what came before. You swear you can almost hear them whispering to each other, centuries apart. You notice that the air here feels cooler, calmer. Maybe it's the thick walls, or the lantern light, or just the quiet presence of so much wisdom crammed into one place. Outside, a gust of wind rattles the door, and a faint spray of sand creeps in at the corners. The scholar stands, fetches a small woven mat, and tucks it against the gap, muttering something about keeping the desert's fingers out of his books. You chuckle softly to yourself at the thought of the Sahara, trying to sneak in and steal a peek. At one point, the scholar brings out a small tray with tiny glasses of steaming tea. You accept yours and take a cautious sip. It's sweet, strong, and minty, and you can feel it waking your tongue even as the rest of your body melts into the cushion. For a while, you just sit there quietly, watching him work. He seems completely at home in this world, pausing now and then to straighten a stack or murmur a correction to himself. You feel a little like a child allowed to stay up past bedtime, too enchanted to move, afraid you'll break the spell. Above your head, the lanterns sway faintly in the breeze sneaking through the cracks. The shadows ripple over the walls, over the shelves, over the manuscripts, making them look like they're breathing. The scholar finally looks up at you again, his eyes amused but kind, and says something you don't quite catch, but your guide translates. You don't own the knowledge. You only keep it safe for the next one. You glance back at the manuscripts on the table, at the ones still nestled safely in their cabinets, and suddenly feel very small. And somehow, that feels okay. The scholar offers you another cup of tea, and as you accept it, you notice the faint smile playing at his lips, like he knows a secret you're not quite ready to hear yet. You sip the tea, warm and sweet, and for just a moment, you forget about the desert waiting outside. The mud walls hold you close, the lanterns hum softly above you, and the manuscripts keep breathing their quiet stories into the night. The scholar rises gracefully, smoothing the front of his robe and motions for you to follow. You reluctantly set down your tea, which, let's be honest, you've been nursing partly just to keep your hands occupied and stand. You trail behind him as he glides toward a cabinet in the far corner of the study. The cabinet looks ordinary enough at first glance, but when he swings open the doors, the air inside seems to change, cooler and somehow heavier. Inside, stacked neatly in rows, are manuscripts unlike any you've seen yet. Their covers shimmer faintly in the lamplight, some gilded with delicate gold leaf, others dyed deep reds and indigos, their edges stitched with thread so fine it's almost invisible. A few are wrapped in silk, so worn it's nearly translucent. You lean closer and catch your breath. These pages don't just hold words, they seem to hold light. The scholar picks one up with both hands, reverently, and places it on a low table in front of you. He unties the thin leather cord holding it shut and gently opens it. The first page is breathtaking, bold black ink in perfect lines, framed with intricate borders of gold and lapis blue. Tiny star-shaped motifs gleam faintly between the lines, and the letters almost seem to dance. You reach out to touch it, but the scholar stops you with a faint shake of his head. You draw your hand back, embarrassed, and he smiles softly as though to say it's all right. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of the most beautiful manuscripts of Timbuktu were produced by master calligraphers who worked for months, sometimes years, to create a single book. They used inks made from crushed minerals, plant dyes, and even powdered gold, applied with reed pens so fine you could write a whole line in the space of your fingernail. Historians still argue whether the most lavish manuscripts were actually meant to be read, or simply displayed as symbols of wealth and learning. The quirky tidbit: some calligraphers were so confident in their craft that they signed their work with tiny riddles hidden in the margins, playful little puzzles for readers to find centuries later, like an ancient version of leaving an Easter egg in your code. The scholar turns a few more pages for you, and each one is more dazzling than the last. On one, a large geometric pattern in gold and green dominates the margin, radiating outward like a quiet sunburst. On another, there's a faint sketch of a desert camel train at the bottom of the page, almost like a doodle left behind during a long night of work. The air in the room feels thick now, warm but somehow invigorating, as if the energy of centuries of scribes and scholars is still alive between these pages. You lean closer and notice something surprising. Not all the text is Arabic. Some of it is in Songhai, Tamashek, and even faint traces of Hebrew, revealing the multicultural fabric of Timbuktu's intellectual life. This wasn't just a city of Muslims or Africans or Arabs. It was a place where ideas collided and mingled in unexpected ways. Your guide whispers that some manuscripts even included diagrams of the stars, maps of trade routes, and recipes for perfumes and ointments. The scholar flips to another page and traces a finger over a particularly delicate piece of script. He glances at you and murmurs something that your guide translates as, Even the stars cannot outshine what is written here. You smile faintly, not quite sure what to say. After a moment, the scholar carefully closes the manuscript, ties it back up with its cord, and places it back in the cabinet. He selects another, this one plainer but thicker, and hands it to you to hold. You cradle it in your hands, surprised by its weight, not just the leather and paper, but the sense of how much it has traveled, how many hands it has passed through, how many stories it has witnessed. You sit cross-legged on the carpet, placing the manuscript gently in your lap, and open it. The pages are a little more worn, the ink more faded, but the elegance remains. You can almost hear the scratch of the reed pen that once moved across the parchment, the faint sigh of the scribe adjusting his posture in the flickering lamplight. Outside, the faint sounds of the city seem to have fallen away entirely. All you can hear is the quiet rustle of the pages and your own breathing. It's easy to imagine, sitting here, what it must have felt like to commission one of these masterpieces. You'd meet with the calligrapher, choose your materials, leather from which animal, gold leaf, or plain ink, which surah of the Quran or which poem to include. Then you'd wait weeks, months, maybe longer. And then one day you'd hold this, your story, written into the fabric of the desert. The scholar rises again and points toward a cabinet along the opposite wall. This one is much smaller, more discreet. Inside, instead of grand manuscripts, are dozens of small, palm-sized books. These, he says softly, were carried by travelers. Notes, prayers, songs, sometimes love poems, sometimes debts. You pick one up, barely bigger than your hand, and open it. Sure enough, the pages are covered in tiny, hurried script, as though written on the road, perhaps balanced on a camel's back. One page catches your eye, a recipe for a healing balm, scrawled in between what looks like a market inventory and a brief lament about the heat. You chuckle quietly and glance up at the scholar, who simply nods, as though to say, yes, even the great scholars needed sunscreen. The guide leans against the wall, arms crossed, watching you with a faint smirk. Maybe you're imagining it, but you think you catch a faint sparkle of approval there too. For a long moment, you simply sit, surrounded by books that glow faintly in the golden light, their pages whispering stories older than your country, your language, even your imagination. And when the scholar finally closes the cabinet and locks it again, you feel a strange pang of longing, like saying goodbye to something you didn't even know you'd missed. You follow the scholar and your guide out of the study, back into the cooling night. The moon now hangs low and heavy above the city, painting everything in a silvery glow. The air smells faintly of dust and wood smoke, and you catch the distant sound of a flute, its notes curling through the alleys like smoke from a quiet fire. This time, your guide leads you not toward the main streets, but into the shadows of a more secluded quarter. The buildings here are older, their walls pockmarked and worn, their doors leaning on sagging hinges. Even the moonlight seems hesitant to enter this part of town. You duck under an archway so low you're forced into an awkward crouch, and emerge in a small courtyard enclosed on all sides. At first it looks empty, just a square of cracked earth and a few stubborn tufts of grass. But then the scholar steps forward and lifts what you thought was just a carpet of sand against one wall. Beneath it is a trapdoor, almost invisible against the mud brick ground. He glances back at you with an amused look, then opens it. A rush of cooler air rises up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of old paper, damp earth, and something faintly metallic, like rain on stone. One by one, you descend a narrow staircase cut directly into the earth, the walls so close you can feel the rough texture of mud and straw brushing your shoulders. At the bottom, you step into a dimly lit chamber that seems impossibly large. The ceiling is low but wide, with wooden beams propping up the weight of the city above. The floor is cool and hard beneath your feet, and the temperature is a full 10 degrees lower than outside. Rows and rows of wooden chests line the room, stacked 2 or 3 high, their surfaces dark with age. In one corner, bundles of manuscripts are tied in cloth and set on simple wooden shelves that bow slightly under their weight. You inhale deeply and feel the air thrum with quiet energy, as though the room itself is alive. Here's your mainstream fact. Timbuktu's residents hid many of their manuscripts underground during times of invasion, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries when militias and extremists targeted cultural heritage. Families dug secret rooms, buried chests under floors, and even built false walls to protect their collections. Historians still argue whether the practice began centuries earlier, possibly during Moroccan invasions in the 16th century, or was a more modern response to colonial and jihadi threats. And the quirky tidbit: some families used to sprinkle crushed herbs and ash between the pages before hiding them, believing it would repel insects and even confuse greedy spirits that might try to steal the knowledge. You imagine a startled beetle running off in a puff of sage and can't help but grin. The scholar lifts the lid of one of the chests and carefully withdraws a thick manuscript wrapped in layers of faded linen. He sets it on a table in the center of the room, undoes the wrappings, and reveals a book so darkened by time it almost blends into the shadows. The pages are stiff and brittle, but when he opens it, the script gleams faintly, still alive despite everything. On the inside cover, you notice faint marks where someone, long ago, had clearly tried to scrub out a name or note. Another mystery scribbled into the margins of history. You trail your fingers lightly along one of the shelves, noticing how each bundle and box has its own little markers. A scrap of indigo cloth, a faint splash of paint, a carved symbol. These markings helped families identify their manuscripts quickly if they ever had to evacuate them in a hurry. Your guide crouches by another chest and lifts the lid to show you manuscripts so tightly packed you can barely see the individual covers. Some are bound in leather hardened to the texture of stone, others in softer skins that still seem to breathe faintly in the cool air. It's almost too much to take in at once. The smell, the texture, the quiet weight of it all pressing down on you like the earth itself. You sit on a small stool, feeling your knees creak like the old wooden beams above, and just listen. You swear you can hear faint echoes, the shuffle of feet above, the scratch of pens, the muffled murmur of prayer or debate. It's probably just the wind through the stairwell, but you let yourself believe anyway. The scholar picks up another manuscript and opens it to reveal page after page of intricate diagrams, concentric circles with tiny symbols written along their edges. Your guide explains that these are astronomical charts used to map the stars as they moved across the desert sky. You glance upward instinctively, even though you're underground, and picture those stars swirling silently above the dunes. Another chest reveals something stranger, a stack of loose pages, written in different hands and languages, as though they'd been gathered hastily. Your guide explains they were probably rescued piecemeal during an invasion, stuffed into a bag and hidden here. Historians still argue whether these mixed manuscripts hold hidden treasures, perhaps even lost works, or whether they're just the forgotten scraps of once proud libraries. The scholar gently closes the lid of one chest after another, his hands lingering for just a moment longer each time, as though saying goodbye. You notice a faint crack in the far wall, just wide enough to let a beam of moonlight slip in, illuminating a patch of floor in pale silver. Dust motes dance in the shaft of light like lazy fireflies. The guide gestures for you to follow him back to the stairs. As you climb slowly upward, you glance back one last time. The underground chamber seems to shimmer faintly in the darkness, a hidden heart beneath the city, still beating after all these years. When you emerge into the night air again, the breeze feels sweeter somehow. The moon has climbed higher, bathing the mud walls in cool white light. The scholar pauses to lock the trapdoor behind him, then turns and gives you a faint smile, equal part. Your guide gives you a small nod of approval, then sets off again down another winding alley. You're starting to wonder how many secret corners this city can possibly have. Every turn seems to reveal another hidden door, another quiet story waiting in the shadows. This time, he leads you out of the main alleys entirely and onto a broad rooftop. The climb is steep, and your calves burn a little by the time you reach the top, but the view is worth it. From here, Timbuktu stretches out before you like a soft, earth-toned labyrinth. The flat rooftops glint faintly under the moonlight, the minarets rise like silent sentinels, and the desert beyond gleams silver and endless. A cool wind brushes your face, carrying the faint scent of something floral, perhaps a lone jasmine bush struggling somewhere below. Your guide gestures to the stars above and then to the city below, as if to remind you. Both have been charted, mapped, and written into these very manuscripts you've been following. You settle onto a low wall, careful not to lean too far and take it all in. The city seems to hum, quietly, confidently, as though proud of the stories it holds. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Timbuktu wasn't just a trade hub, it was an intellectual capital. At its peak, it hosted some 25,000 students, an enormous number for its time, who came from all over West Africa and beyond to study theology, law, astronomy, medicine, and more. Scholars debated under the stars, scribes worked by lamplight, and knowledge flowed as freely as gold dust. Historians still argue whether this reputation was slightly exaggerated by early European explorers, but no one denies its role as a beacon of learning in the medieval world. You shift your gaze from the stars to the city again, trying to imagine what it must have looked like at its busiest. Thousands of students crowding courtyards, camels jostling at the gates, merchants shouting prices in a dozen languages. Your guide sits beside you, crossing his legs comfortably, and points toward a cluster of rooftops near the edge of town. Those, he says, belong to the healers. You squint and sure enough, you can make out a series of smaller buildings, each with tiny gardens on their roofs. The quirky tidbit: Timbuktu's healers, part doctor, part herbalist, part philosopher, often kept their remedies growing right above their heads. Rooftop gardens full of aloe, henna, saffron, mint, and even wild desert onions. Sometimes they wrote their recipes in the margins of medical manuscripts, alongside notes like "works better if sung to," or "don't forget to thank the moon." Your guide pulls something from the pocket of his robe, a tiny bundle of dried herbs tied with a strip of indigo cloth. He hands it to you without explanation. It smells sharp and calming all at once, and you tuck it into your own pocket with a faint smile. You lean back against the wall and let your gaze drift upward again. The sky here feels impossibly close, like a dark dome pinpricked with light. The stars seem to pulse faintly, almost as if they're watching you in return. Your guide murmurs something about the constellations, and how the old scholars believed the stars not only guided caravans, but also dictated the most auspicious times to start a journey, to bury a manuscript, to harvest aloe, even to propose marriage. You wonder briefly what the stars would say about you, sitting here, covered in dust, clutching someone else's herbs, half in love with a city you barely understand. Below you, the city's quiet rhythm continues. A soft drum beat from some distant courtyard, a snatch of singing carried on the breeze, the faint clatter of a door being closed. You hear the faint scrape of a pen on paper and realize the guide has pulled out a scrap of parchment and is writing something in that fluid, looping Arabic script you've been admiring all evening. When he finishes, he folds it neatly and hands it to you without a word. You open it slowly. Just one line, written in ink so dark it shines. Even the desert blooms when someone remembers where to look. You let out a soft laugh, half wonder, half disbelief, and glance at him. But he's already looking back at the stars as though nothing happened. Historians still argue whether the intellectual culture of Timbuktu declined because of external invasions, shifting trade routes, or simply the natural ebb and flow of civilizations. But sitting here, it doesn't feel like it ever really disappeared. You close your eyes for a moment and let the sounds of the city wrap around you. The whisper of wind against mud walls, the faint creak of wooden beams cooling in the night air, the soft murmur of prayers drifting skyward. When you open them again, the guide has stood and is extending a hand to help you up. You glance out over the city one last time, letting your eyes linger on the rooftops, the quiet courtyards, the sliver of desert beyond. Somewhere below, the manuscripts wait tucked into chests, buried under floors, hidden in false walls, waiting for someone to listen, to read, to remember. And as you follow the guide back down the narrow stairs, you find yourself whispering the line he wrote for you, just to hear how it sounds in your own voice. Even the desert blooms when someone remembers where to look. You tuck the parchment into your pocket next to the herbs and smile faintly. You follow the guide down the stairs and back into the quiet streets, feeling almost as if you've stepped into another version of the city, one you couldn't have seen before tonight. The moon is higher now, throwing crisp shadows across the alleyways. The air has cooled noticeably, carrying a hint of moisture and the faint scent of baking bread from some hidden oven. You find yourself walking slower, trying to memorize the texture of the walls under your fingers, the way the lanterns sway above doorways, the subtle hum of life behind closed shutters. The guide pauses at a nondescript corner where two narrow alleys meet, then gestures toward a small door set flush into the wall. Unlike the others you've seen, this door is painted a soft green and reinforced with metal strips. Without knocking, he pushes it open and beckons you inside. You step into a long, low room lined with shelves, but this time the manuscripts aren't neatly stacked or wrapped in linen. They're scattered haphazardly, piled into baskets, laid across tables in loose heaps. There's a faint scent of dust and beeswax here, mixed with something sharper, perhaps ink or the faint tang of old glue. A young boy, perhaps 12, sits cross-legged on the floor, carefully brushing dust from a fragile page with what looks like a bundle of feathers. He looks up at you and grins before returning to his work. Your guide whispers something that sounds like restoration room, and you realize you've stumbled into the delicate, ongoing effort to keep these ancient manuscripts alive. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Timbuktu, manuscript restoration has long been a family trade, passed from parent to child. Specialists trained to mend torn pages with fine thread, clean ink-stained margins, and even rebind entire volumes using traditional materials. Some of these techniques haven't changed in over 500 years. Historians still argue whether modern conservation methods, like climate-controlled vaults, are better or whether the traditional ways of wrapping and burying in cool earth remain the most effective in Timbuktu's climate. You kneel beside the boy and watch as he brushes away another thin layer of sand, revealing the neat, flowing lines of script beneath. He glances at you, then leans closer and whispers in French-accented English, "They always come back to life." You smile at that. In one corner of the room, an older man works with quiet concentration, sewing the spine of a battered manuscript using what appears to be thread made from animal sinew. He hums under his breath, a tune that feels older than any song you know, and occasionally blows lightly on the page to clear stray dust. The quirky tidbit: some families believed manuscripts could heal themselves if simply left wrapped in linen with a sprig of mint or sage, a kind of manuscript spa treatment. Modern scholars roll their eyes, but oddly enough, many such pages have survived better than ones locked away in glass. You wander between the tables, noticing the variety. Thin pages covered in tightly packed script, others with wide margins and elegant headings in gold, some written on animal parchment, others on thick, soft paper. A young woman at another table is carefully unrolling what looks like a scroll, layers of brittle paper, revealing a series of intricate geometric patterns, interspersed with notes about lunar phases and water levels. She glances up at you and winks before turning back to her work, her fingers moving like a musician. Your guide pulls out a chair for you and places a slim, battered book in front of you. Its leather cover is cracked and darkened, but the faint trace of a floral pattern is still visible if you tilt it just right. You open it carefully. The pages smell faintly of dust and almonds. On one page, you notice a faded seal, perhaps a family crest or a scholar's mark, alongside neat rows of text that your guide translates as medical advice for summer fevers. The next page contains several lines of verse, delicately squeezed into the margin as though whoever owned it just couldn't help but add their own poetry. You chuckle softly, imagining someone 400 years ago scribbling love poems in their anatomy textbook. From a small alcove, another boy emerges carrying a bowl of warm water and a pile of soft cloths. He and the girl set about gently wiping down some of the more damaged covers, humming a tune together as they work. You realize that this isn't just a job, it's a kind of quiet devotion. The manuscripts aren't merely artifacts here. They're family, to be cared for, fussed over, and even gently scolded if necessary. In the far corner, you spot a stack of books wrapped in bright blue fabric, a color so vivid it almost seems to glow in the dim light. Your guide follows your gaze and murmurs that these are special. Manuscripts containing rare songs and stories, wrapped in indigo to protect them from bad eyes, and to signal their sacred or joyful nature. You lean back in your chair, letting the soft sounds of the room wash over you, the scrape of brushes, the quiet murmur of instructions, the rhythmic pull of thread through leather. Historians still argue whether the manuscript restoration traditions of Timbuktu began purely out of necessity or also as a kind of subtle resistance, a way of saying, you can burn our buildings, but you will not burn our memory. You glance around one last time and notice something you hadn't before, faint white chalk marks on the floor, forming a loose grid. Perhaps a way to keep the stacks organized, or maybe something older, a ritual, a prayer for the room itself. Your guide finally rises and touches your shoulder lightly. It's time to go. You stand, tucking the parchment and herbs more securely in your pocket, and offer a small bow to the room. The boy with the feather brush looks up, grins again, and says softly, "Come back soon. They like visitors." You step back into the cool night, feeling as though you're leaving not just a room, but a whole hidden world behind. The door closes quietly, and the faint sound of brushing and humming lingers in your ears as you move on. You and your guide slip back into the moonlit streets, and this time, you notice how your own footsteps echo differently now, softer somehow, more deliberate. The air has cooled further, and the faintest hint of dawn lurks somewhere below the horizon, just enough to tinge the edges of the sky with a faint, sleepy purple. Your guide glances over his shoulder at you with a sly smile, and turns into another alley you swear you haven't walked before. At the end of the alley, you find yourself standing in front of an old wooden gate that doesn't look like much. In fact, it seems to sag slightly, its hinges groaning when pushed open. But beyond the gate lies something entirely unexpected, a garden. It's modest, yes, a square of dark earth bordered by mud brick walls, but alive in a way that almost startles you. Low shrubs, vines climbing the walls, herbs spilling over cracked clay pots. Jasmine, mint, aloe, even a few tiny date palms stretch their fronds upward, as if competing for moonlight. You inhale deeply and immediately catch the scent of wet earth and crushed leaves, sharper and sweeter than anything you've breathed in all night. This, your guide says, was where the scholars came to think. You can see why. A narrow path winds through the garden, leading to a stone bench at its center. You sit without waiting to be asked, sinking gratefully into the cool stone, and let your eyes wander over the greenery glowing faintly in the moonlight. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of Timbuktu's scholars maintained gardens alongside their libraries, using them not only to grow medicinal herbs, but also to cultivate a sense of calm. a space to reflect and debate ideas under the stars. Some even believed certain plants sharpened the mind or helped one remember verses more easily. Historians still argue whether these gardens were modeled after earlier Persian or North African traditions, or if they sprang up organically from the desert communities' own ingenuity. The quirky tidbit: some manuscripts even recommend sniffing crushed mint leaves before reciting poetry to ensure your words will not wither before they bloom. You pluck a leaf from the nearest bush, crush it gently between your fingers, and hold it to your nose. The sharp, sweet scent cuts through the sleepiness gathering in your mind. Your guide kneels by a low planter box and brushes away a bit of sand to reveal a tiny mosaic embedded in the soil. Faint blue and gold tiles spell out what you can just barely make out as: the garden remembers what you forget. You smile at that, tucking it away beside the other quiet wisdom you've gathered tonight. As you sit, you notice small clay tags poking out of the earth beside certain plants. Some are etched with neat Arabic script, naming the plant and its uses: mint for clarity, saffron for the stomach, aloe for burns, while others simply say things like good for heartbreak or stronger under a full moon. Your guide plucks a single jasmine blossom and hands it to you without explanation. You twirl it absently between your fingers, catching its heady fragrance. You hear a faint trickle of water and notice, hidden in the far corner, a tiny fountain no taller than your knees. Its bowl is cracked and worn smooth, but a thin stream of water still burbles from its spout, catching the moonlight in little flashes. You let your gaze drift to the walls surrounding you. Even here, the scholars left their mark, faint lines of poetry etched into the mud brick, half hidden by vines. One reads, "The desert has no memory, but the garden does." Another, "To learn is to plant seeds you may never see bloom." The air feels heavier here, but not in an oppressive way, more like a thick, comforting quilt. You imagine what it must have been like centuries ago. Students seated cross-legged in the dirt, debating under the stars, fingers stained with ink and soil alike. Someone scribbling a note on a scrap of parchment while the scent of jasmine mingled with the warm night air. Your guide stands and dusts off his hands, then gestures for you to follow the path further. It leads to a smaller alcove tucked away behind the main garden, where a single, massive baobab tree rises like a sentinel, its thick trunk pale in the moonlight. Its roots curl around old stones and disappear beneath the earth. At its base sits another bench, this one carved with delicate patterns of stars and crescents. You sit here too, feeling the rough texture of the stone beneath your fingers. Your guide whispers that the baobab has stood here longer than the oldest manuscript you've seen tonight, perhaps longer than the city itself. Historians still argue whether this very tree was planted deliberately as part of the scholars' garden, or whether it simply sprouted and endured, becoming part of the story whether it was invited or not. You tilt your head back and look up into its branches, which seem to stretch endlessly, disappearing into the dark. A faint breeze rattles the leaves, and for a moment you almost think you hear words in the sound, soft and indistinct, but unmistakably human. Your guide picks up a small stone from the ground and hands it to you. You turn it over in your hand. It's warm from the earth, etched faintly with a crescent and what might be a star. For a long while, neither of you speaks. The garden seems to hum. You follow the guide out of the garden, back into the labyrinth of alleys, and the city seems even quieter now, as though the whole place has settled into a gentle, contented silence, waiting patiently for the sun. The air has cooled further, with just enough bite to wake you slightly. You pull your robe a little tighter and notice that the indigo dye has left a faint dusting of blue on your hands. You smile to yourself, a small souvenir you hadn't expected. This time, your guide leads you toward the very edge of the city. The houses here are fewer and farther apart, and the walls have begun to crumble in places where the desert is slowly reclaiming its ground. Beyond the final row of buildings, The dunes rise up in pale, shifting waves, gleaming softly under the moonlight. You hesitate at the edge of the sand, but your guide motions for you to follow, and soon your feet are sinking into cool, fine grains. The walk is quiet, save for the faint whisper of wind across the dunes. In the distance, you can just make out the faint outlines of what looks like a stone structure, half buried in sand. As you draw closer, you realize it's the ruins of an old caravanserai, a resting place for traders and travelers crossing the Sahara. Its low walls are worn smooth by centuries of wind, its roof long since collapsed, but the skeleton of it still stands, defiant and serene in the desert night. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Timbuktu sat at a crossroads of trade routes, and countless caravanserais like this one once dotted the edges of the desert, offering shelter, water, and food to merchants hauling gold, salt, books, and more. Some caravanserais even doubled as informal libraries, where traders could borrow manuscripts to read during their stay. Historians still argue whether the caravanserais were owned by the city's wealthiest families or collectively maintained by the trading guilds. You step through the low archway and into the open courtyard, where the sand has gathered in rippling patterns, soft as velvet. The quirky tidbit: some travelers were known to leave behind little poems or riddles scratched into the stones of the caravanserai walls, a way of marking their journey and leaving something for the next weary soul to ponder. You notice a few faint lines carved into the wall to your left. You trace them lightly, and your guide translates. "I carried salt to the ocean, gold to the sun, and wisdom home." You chuckle quietly, imagining some exhausted merchant scratching that into the wall with a dagger before collapsing into sleep. Your guide gestures toward a corner where the stones form a low bench. You sit, letting the sand sift between your fingers and stare up at the sky. Out here, away from the city lights, the stars are impossibly bright. They don't just shine, they blaze. Constellations you don't recognize seem to twist and shift above you. You find yourself picking out a few familiar ones, but most of them feel alien and new, as if you've stepped into someone else's sky entirely. Your guide sits beside you, his robe pooling around him, and begins to hum softly, a low, steady melody that blends perfectly with the quiet of the desert. You close your eyes and listen, feeling the cool night air settle around you. When you open them again, he's pointing out toward the horizon, where a faint line of darker sand marks what he calls the Whispering Dunes. According to him, on certain nights, the wind moves through them just right, and the dunes sing a low, haunting hum that carries for miles. You tilt your head, and sure enough, you can almost hear it. Just a faint vibration, like a giant breath moving through the earth. Historians still argue whether this phenomenon is caused purely by shifting grains of sand or by some hidden acoustic property of the desert itself. Either way, it feels a little like magic. Your guide stands and begins to walk slowly along the inner walls of the ruin, running his fingers over the stones. You follow, noticing more faint carvings as you go: names, dates, prayers. One simply says, "Tell the dunes I was here." You stop at the far end of the courtyard, where a few tumbled stones form a sort of altar or platform. In the moonlight, you can see faint scraps of paper tucked into the cracks between the stones, tiny prayers written by travelers, some so faded they're barely legible. You lean closer and catch a few words on one slip: "For safe passage, for memory, for rain." Your guide picks up a small handful of sand, lets it pour slowly through his fingers, and says quietly, "They thought the desert forgets, but it remembers everything." You glance back at the caravanserai's entrance, imagining all the people who pass through here: merchants in brightly colored robes, scholars clutching scrolls to their chests, camels groaning under impossible loads, the occasional thief slipping through shadows. All of them leaving something behind, even if just the faintest trace of themselves in the stones or the sand. You sit back down on the bench, letting the cool stone press into your palms, and tilt your head skyward one more time. It occurs to you a little cheekily that the manuscripts of Timbuktu aren't the only library here. The city itself is a book, and out here in the dunes are the footnotes. The wind shifts again, sending a small plume of sand skittering across the floor. You stand, brush the sand from your robe, and follow your guide back toward the city, your footsteps already half erased by the whispering dunes behind you. When you reach the edge of the walls again, you glance back one last time. The ruins are quiet and still under the stars, but somehow they don't feel empty. You tuck your hands into your pockets, fingers brushing the herbs, the parchment, the stone, and step back into the shadow of the city. You follow the guide back through the quiet gates of Timbuktu, the city now cloaked in a stillness so deep it feels sacred. The faint purple at the edge of the horizon has deepened slightly, hinting that dawn is inching closer, but for now the world remains suspended in this perfect, moonlit hush. The streets are nearly empty. A stray cat slips between the shadows, and somewhere far off a wooden door creaks softly. You're surprised by how easily your feet remember the paths now, how quickly the maze of alleys has started to feel less foreign and more like a dream you've had before. The guide leads you this time toward the oldest part of the city, where the walls are patched with layers of history. Mud brick here bears faint traces of paint, names and dates scratched shallowly into the surface and worn smooth by centuries of hands. At last you stop at a tall, narrow building, its door reinforced with thick bands of iron and painted a faded ochre. It looks more fortress than library, and you can feel the cool draft leaking from around the threshold. The guide produces a heavy key, turns it with a soft click, and pushes the door open just enough for you both to slip inside. You find yourself in a long, vaulted hall. Thin beams of moonlight stream through high slits in the walls, illuminating motes of dust that drift lazily in the cool air. Unlike the secret rooms or the scattered restoration spaces you've already seen, this library is formal, orderly, even regal. The shelves stretch high and straight, built from dark wood polished to a soft gleam filled edge to edge with manuscripts bound in leather, linen, and vellum. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Timbuktu's oldest libraries were more than mere book storage. They were community anchors. Families often opened their libraries to neighbors and travelers, holding debates, readings, and even meals among the manuscripts. Some libraries date back to the 14th century and remain in private hands to this day. Historians still argue whether these libraries originally grew from mosques, teaching collections, or if families amassed them independently as a mark of prestige. You trail your fingers lightly along a row of spines, feeling the cracked leather and cool linen under your fingertips. Some volumes are marked with tiny painted dots or stamped symbols you don't recognize, perhaps a way of cataloging that's long since been forgotten. The guide lights a small lantern and leads you deeper into the hall, past alcoves where stacks of wrapped manuscripts rest like sleeping animals, past a glass-fronted cabinet holding particularly fragile texts. In the far corner, a low table sits surrounded by cushions. You kneel, and the guide places a manuscript before you, this one bound in soft leather the color of sand, its corners reinforced with brass. You open it delicately, and the pages are astonishing. Lines of flowing Arabic script in black and gold, with small illustrations of stars, plants, and water channels snaking through the margins. You can almost hear the scribe's pen scratching faintly in your mind. Imagine the smell of fresh ink, the quiet concentration of a scholar hunched over this very page. The quirky tidbit. Some scribes would leave cheeky little notes at the end of their work, playful warnings to future readers. One famously wrote, "If you do not return this book, may your tea always be bitter and your slippers always cold." You grin at the thought and wonder how many such hidden jests lie waiting in the stacks around you. You rise and explore slowly, moving from shelf to shelf. Each seems to hold a different theme. law, medicine, astronomy, poetry. One small niche is entirely devoted to correspondence, letters bundled and tied, their edges frayed but still faintly perfumed. Your guide motions you over to a glass display where a single manuscript rests open. Its pages shimmer faintly in the lamplight, ink so dense and black it almost seems wet. He murmurs that this is one of the oldest texts in the city, a treatise on ethics written when much of Europe was still crawling out of the Dark Ages. Historians still argue whether some of the texts preserved here influenced European scholars through Spain's Andalusian libraries. If Timbuktu's words cross the desert and sea to shape other worlds. You sit back on the cushion, letting your eyes wander over the countless volumes stacked around you, and you feel a peculiar kind of weight, not heavy exactly, but substantial, as though every one of these books is a small stone in a great tower of memory, and you're sitting at its base. Somewhere high above, a faint breeze whistles through the slits in the walls. The lantern flickers. You can hear your own breathing mingling with the faint rustle of pages settling themselves on the shelves. In the center of the room stands a single, ancient chest bound with bronze bands. Your guide approaches it reverently and opens it just enough for you to glimpse what's inside. A tight bundle of manuscripts wrapped in indigo and tied with golden cord. He closes it again gently, then rests a hand on its lid and whispers something too soft for you to catch. For a long while, you simply sit there in the glow of the lantern, surrounded by the quiet presence of these thousands of voices. The walls seem to hum faintly, not quite a sound, more like a sensation just under your skin. You close the manuscript before you and trace your fingers over its cover, feeling the faint indentations left by centuries of hands. Then you stand, leaving it carefully where it was, and follow your guide back toward the door. At the threshold, you glance back one last time. The long rows of books, the shimmering pages, the quiet weight of it all. You find yourself whispering softly to no one in particular, "I'll remember." Your guide nods faintly, as though he heard you anyway. You step out into the alley again, the door closing behind you with a soft, final click. The door closes with that soft, decisive sound, and the night air greets you like an old friend, cool, dry, and faintly perfumed with dust and earth. You stand there for a moment, adjusting to the outside world again. The weight of what you just saw lingers in your chest, heavier and yet somehow comforting, like wearing a borrowed coat that still smells faintly of its owner. Your guide is already walking, and you hurry to catch up. He seems to glide through the alleys now, more confident than ever, as though your journey together is gaining momentum, hurtling towards something inevitable. This time he leads you along a narrow passageway until it widens into what feels like a courtyard, though there is no roof overhead, only the night sky, now beginning to pale slightly at the edges. In the center of the courtyard stands a low, squat tower, square and unadorned, its mud brick walls scarred by wind and time. Unlike the previous places, there is no door to unlock, no threshold to cross, just a single, gaping archway inviting you in. You hesitate before stepping over the worn stone threshold, and your guide gestures encouragingly, as if to say, "Don't worry, this one remembers everyone who visits." Inside, it's cooler than you expect, and the silence is absolute. A faint scent of dry paper and something metallic, perhaps the bricks themselves, hovers in the air. You realize quickly this isn't a library in the traditional sense. It's more like a vault. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In addition to libraries and family archives, Timbuktu once maintained public repositories for the most precious manuscripts, texts deemed too important, rare, or politically sensitive to be left in private homes. These vaults were sometimes buried beneath mosques or hidden in plain sight, guarded by trusted families who passed down the responsibility like a sacred charge. Historians still argue whether all the manuscripts were ever truly cataloged. Some say thousands remain unaccounted for, quietly slumbering in hiding places yet to be uncovered. The walls of the vault are lined with shelves set into the mud brick itself, each recess filled with tightly wrapped bundles of manuscripts. Most are bound in linen and sealed with wax or strips of colored cloth, red, blue, gold. Your guide picks up one such bundle and hands it to you. The linen is soft and slightly frayed at the edges, and you can feel the faint contours of the manuscript through the fabric. You turn it over in your hands, but don't unwrap it. Somehow that feels wrong, like peeking at someone else's diary. The quirky tidbit. Some vaults, like this one, were intentionally mise-marked to confuse intruders. During times of invasion, their walls were disguised to look like ordinary storage rooms or even stables, with manuscripts hidden behind false panels or under piles of straw. One story even claims a vault was once guarded by a particularly territorial goat, who frightened off looters by butting them in the knees. You set the bundle back carefully and wander along the shelves, noticing small, cryptic symbols scratched above each alcove. The guide explains, through a mix of words and gestures, that these aren't catalog numbers but charms, protective blessings meant to keep away fire, water, and ill will. In the far corner of the room stands a wooden chest, its lid carved with a simple crescent moon. Your guide opens it and lets you peek inside, a collection of tiny scrolls so fragile they seem to sigh when the air hits them. You catch just a glimpse of an intricate map drawn in ink, so fine it resembles spider silk. Then the chest is gently closed again. You move toward the center of the vault where a single, square stone juts slightly from the floor. It's polished smooth from countless feet stepping on it. Your guide taps it lightly with his foot, then gestures for you to try. You step on it. Nothing happens at first, and then faintly, you feel a subtle vibration underfoot. The guide whispers something you don't quite catch, but the meaning is clear enough. This is the heart of the vault. The stone beneath your feet has soaked up centuries of footsteps, prayers, and secrets, and it hums softly in acknowledgement of yours. You crouch, resting a hand on the stone, feeling its coolness against your skin. Historians still argue whether such stones were symbolic or functional, whether they marked burial sites, sacred foundations, or merely served as convenient landmarks for nervous scribes to pace around while thinking. You close your eyes, and for a moment the vault seems to breathe with you. The faint scent of paper and ink, the quiet press of air, the weight of all these silent words coiled up in the dark, waiting. When you open your eyes again, your guide is watching you patiently. You step back into the alley, and this time the city seems to greet you differently, as though it recognizes you now, acknowledges you as one of its own. The wind is softer, the shadows friendlier, and even the sand beneath your feet seems to carry you along more willingly. Your guide doesn't say a word. He simply walks ahead and you follow, weaving deeper into the maze. The faint glow of dawn is starting to push against the horizon, washing the edges of the buildings with a blush of muted gold. At last, the guide stops in front of a crumbling wall that looks almost abandoned. There's no door here, only a narrow crack between two stones, wide enough for one person to slip through. He motions you forward, and you squeeze into the opening, emerging into a space that takes your breath away. This hidden chamber is unlike anything you've seen tonight. It's small, no bigger than a modest living room, but its walls are completely covered in painted murals. Swirling patterns of deep blues and ochres, interwoven with lines of calligraphy and delicate illustrations of stars, rivers, and desert animals. You stand in the center, craning your neck to take it all in, and the guide allows you a long moment of silence. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Not all of Timbuktu's manuscripts were written down in neat books. Some knowledge was painted directly onto walls, especially in private or sacred spaces. These murals often served as memory aids, blending text and imagery to teach lessons or recount stories to those who couldn't read. Historians still argue whether these mural rooms were intended solely for teaching, meditation, or even quiet forms of worship. You trace your fingers along a line of text that curls into the shape of a crescent moon, the paint faintly gritty under your touch. The script here feels more fluid, almost playful, as though the scribe who painted it was enjoying himself. The quirky tidbit: some mural rooms contained deliberate mistakes, hidden jokes or riddles painted into the walls for sharp-eyed visitors to find. You spot one now, a tiny camel painted upside down in the corner with the faint words beside it. Even the wise may stumble. You chuckle softly to yourself and continue circling the room. One wall is entirely dedicated to a painted map, but it's not the kind of map you're used to. It doesn't seem to show just physical places. Instead, it mixes cities and stars, rivers and constellations, as though saying, "To know this world, you must also know the heavens." You stand before it for a while, letting your eyes wander over the painted trails. There are familiar names you recognize: Cairo, Gao, Granada, and others that are completely unfamiliar, written in scripts you can't decipher. Your guide joins you by the map and points to a small golden star painted at the top. Then he points at you. You blink, unsure what he means, but the message is clear enough. You are here too. You grin faintly, letting the idea settle over you like the soft weight of a blanket. You wander toward another wall, where scenes of daily life are painted in lively strokes. Scholars sitting cross-legged beneath a tree, a family sharing a meal, a caravan of camels moving across the desert. Here and there, small verses of poetry are woven into the images, written so lightly they almost disappear into the colors. One reads, "The book remembers what the lips forget." Another, "Between sand and star, we find ourselves." You sit down on a low stone bench set against the wall and lean back, staring at the ceiling. Even up there, faint patterns are painted, constellations swirling above a stylized desert, with little gold dots marking what you assume are important stars. The silence here is different from the silence of the vault. This one feels warm, alive, even mischievous. You swear you can almost hear faint laughter somewhere, a gentle reminder that knowledge doesn't have to be solemn to be profound. Historians still argue whether these painted rooms were secret classrooms, personal sanctuaries, or simply the eccentric projects of wealthy scholars who preferred their lessons with a splash of color. You close your eyes and let yourself sink into the soft hum of the space. When you open them again, you notice a small wooden box tucked into the corner, its lid slightly ajar. Inside are several brushes, still stained with pigment, and a handful of small parchment scraps covered in practice strokes, loops and dots, doodles and half-finished verses. You pick up one scrap and smile at the words scribbled there. "If you can read this, you're too close." You set it back gently and stand, giving the room one last, long look. Your guide is waiting at the narrow crack in the wall. As you squeeze back through, you feel a faint tickle of dry air brush your cheek, almost like a whisper, "Come back when you can." You step back into the alley, blinking at the soft morning light now beginning to fill the sky. The shadows of the city have softened, and everything seems touched with gold. For a moment, you close your eyes and picture the painted map behind you, a tangle of stars and rivers, and imagine that somewhere on it, a tiny golden dot still marks your place. You open your eyes, feeling lighter somehow, and follow your guide once more through the waking streets. The morning has fully arrived now, though the sun itself still hides just below the horizon. The air has shifted, warmer, yet still crisp, and the streets of Timbuktu are beginning to stir. You follow the guide through the slowly awakening city, past doorways where sleepy merchants are rolling up mats, past children carrying baskets of bread, and past a woman sweeping a little crescent of sand away from her threshold. This time, your guide doesn't take you down any alleys. Instead, you climb a gentle slope toward what looks like one of the city's highest points. As you ascend, the rooftops around you drop away, and you catch fleeting glimpses of the desert stretching endlessly beyond the city walls. At the top of the slope sits a small, square tower, its upper edge lined with a low parapet. It isn't grand, in fact. It seems almost plain compared to the painted room you just left, but it commands a view of the entire city. You reach the base of the tower and follow your guide up a narrow, winding staircase carved into the mud brick. The steps are shallow but worn slick by countless feet before yours. At the top, you emerge into a quiet, open space no bigger than a modest room, with 3 walls and an open side facing east. The view steals your breath. Below you, Timbuktu sprawls in warm tones of ochre and gold, its flat rooftops and crooked alleys glowing faintly in the first blush of morning light. Beyond the city's edge, the dunes ripple outward like a golden sea, and in the far distance, you think you can just barely see the shimmer of the river. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many of Timbuktu's libraries and mosques maintained lookout towers like this one, not for defense, but for timekeeping. At dawn and dusk, caretakers would climb these towers to mark the day's prayers and observe the weather, sometimes even recording celestial events. Historians still argue whether some towers were also used as rudimentary observatories, allowing scholars to track the stars and chart calendars. You step to the edge of the parapet, resting your hands on the cool stone, and take a long breath. The quirky tidbit: one scholar reportedly kept a small mirror up here to catch the sun each morning, believing that capturing the first light brought clarity of thought for the rest of the day. Your guide produces just such a mirror from his sleeve and sets it on the parapet. You watch as the sun peeks over the dunes, and the mirror flares to life, throwing a tiny star of light onto the wall. You chuckle softly and whisper, "Not a bad way to start the day." Your guide grins, clearly pleased that you've caught the point. You circle the small space slowly, letting your eyes trace the city below. Here and there, you recognize places you've already visited: the hidden garden, the painted room, the vault. You can even spot the faint outline of the caravanserai out in the dunes beyond the walls. It strikes you that each of those places is a page in a much larger book, and you've been quietly reading your way through it all night. Your guide gestures toward a corner of the parapet where an old, cracked tile has been set into the floor. On it are etched the words, "When you reach the top, remember to look down." You smile faintly and crouch there, looking more closely. Around the tile, faint scratches mark names, dates, little prayers, the sort of quiet graffiti left behind by visitors over the centuries. One reads, "May the city remember me." Another simply says, "Found the sun here." You pull your robe tighter against the chill wind and let yourself sink into the silence of the moment. For a while, you and the guide just stand there together, watching the city wake up. Smoke begins to curl from rooftops. A rooster crows somewhere below. Children's laughter echoes faintly up the slope. Historians still argue whether the tower's main purpose was purely functional, a way to announce prayer times, or whether they served as quiet sanctuaries for reflection, where scholars and caretakers could slip away from the noise of the city below. From here, it's easy to believe it was both. You rest your palms on the stone, feeling its chill gradually warming under the newborn sun. You catch a faint scent of mint still clinging to your hands, a memory of the garden, and you notice how the city seems to glow more with every passing moment, as though the manuscripts, the murals, the vaults, and the gardens are all quietly lighting up from within. Your guide picks up the mirror and slips it back into his sleeve, then rests a hand on your shoulder. He doesn't speak, but his meaning is clear enough. It's time to descend. You take one last, long look at the city stretched below you. Timbuktu, quiet and sprawling, golden and alive. You whisper softly to yourself, or perhaps to the city, "I'll carry this with me." Then you turn back to the stairway and follow your guide down, the faint sound of the city beginning to rise around you, a gentle chorus of life waking for the day. The stairway spirals down, the walls brushing your shoulders as you descend. At the base of the tower, you step back into the streets, which are now bustling in the soft light of morning. The city feels entirely different in daylight. The same alleys you wandered through in darkness now shine in hues of warm honey and soft clay. Merchants are arranging colorful fabrics on wooden stalls. The smell of baking bread curls around every corner, and children dart through the crowd, laughing. Your guide walks ahead at an unhurried pace, weaving through the people with practiced ease. You follow, letting the rhythm of the city carry you along, your footsteps blending seamlessly into its pulse. He leads you toward a quieter part of town, where the houses are smaller, their doors painted in cheerful blues and greens. Here, you notice a few people sitting outside, sipping tea and exchanging sleepy greetings. At last, you arrive at a modest doorway with a faded curtain fluttering in the breeze. Your guide holds the curtain aside, and you step through into what seems to be a simple family courtyard. In the center sits a low table set with tea, fresh flatbread, and a small dish of honey. The smell of mint wafts from a steaming pot nearby. Your guide motions for you to sit, and you lower yourself onto a cushion, feeling the weight of the night and everything you've seen settle over you like a warm blanket. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many families in Timbuktu still begin their mornings exactly like this, with tea, bread, and quiet conversation in the courtyard before the heat of the day sets in. This ritual of shared tea is as much a part of the city's cultural fabric as its manuscripts and mosques. Historians still argue whether the custom was originally brought from Morocco, the Middle East, or developed locally as part of trans-Saharan hospitality. Your guide pours you a glass of amber tea and hands it to you with a faint smile. The first sip is scalding but sweet, the taste of mint sharp and refreshing on your tongue. You exhale slowly, letting the warmth spread through you, and glance around the courtyard. The walls here are painted with faint designs, geometric shapes, and curling vines. In one corner, a small shelf holds a few worn books and what looks like a family ledger. The quirky tidbit: families in Timbuktu would sometimes hide tiny slips of poetry in their ledgers alongside financial notes, quiet reminders to themselves that life was about more than numbers. You spot one here, barely legible. Weigh gold but cherish words. You smile faintly, imagining someone sneaking that in between calculations for camels and salt. Your guide breaks a piece of bread and hands it to you. As you eat, the courtyard fills with the gentle sounds of the city waking fully. A donkey brays somewhere nearby. A woman calls out to her children, and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer begins to ring in the distance. You sit back on your cushion and close your eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the tea, the bread soft in your hands, the soft murmur of life all around you. When you open them again, your guide is watching you quietly, his expression both amused and approving, as though he knows you've finally begun to understand something he didn't need to explain. You realize suddenly that this courtyard is just another kind of library, a living manuscript written in bread crumbs, tea leaves, and quiet company. Historians still argue whether the true heart of Timbuktu lies in its manuscripts or in its people, but sitting here, you begin to suspect the answer might simply be yes. You drain the last of your tea and set the glass gently on the table. Your guide rises, and you follow, stepping back into the street. The city is fully awake now, bright, bustling, alive. You stand there for a moment, letting the sun warm your face, feeling the strange weight and lightness of the night's journey mingling in your chest. You turn one last time, taking in the alleys, the walls, the doorways, the faint smell of mint and dust. You whisper almost too softly to hear yourself, "I won't forget." And then, at last, you let the city fold you into its morning and you walk away. And now, as you step away from the city, you notice how the golden light has softened the sharp edges of the walls, and how the air feels warmer, calmer. The noise of the streets fades behind you, replaced by the gentle hush of the desert breeze. You keep walking at an easy pace, feeling the sand give slightly under your feet, your robe swaying around your legs. Every breath you take is slow and even now, scented faintly with mint, dust, and sun-warmed earth. You pause and glance back once more. Timbuktu glows quietly in the distance, neither loud nor grand, but steady and sure, like a lamp left burning in the dark. You feel a sense of gratitude welling up, quiet and deep, like water from a well. The city begins to recede from view, but the memories linger. The painted walls, the hush of the vault, the warm bread, the shimmer of the morning sun on the tower. The air grows softer still, and your footsteps slow until you're barely moving. You close your eyes for a moment and feel the faint vibration of the earth beneath you, the whisper of the dunes somewhere far away, the echo of words and laughter long gone. The city may be behind you now, but its stories and your place among them remain. You take one last breath, long and easy, and let yourself sink into the quiet, into the golden hush, into sleep. Sweet dreams.